Calling something pretentious is the easiest way to both boost your own intelligence and degrade the quality of a piece of work. By calling something pretentious, one must be on a level above the work in order to look down on it. One must see through the fake deepness of it all, therefore making you smarter than the actual work you're critiquing. But what does pretentious really mean? The Cambridge Dictionary defines pretentious as, quote, trying to appear or sound more important or smarter than you are, especially in matters of art and literature, end quote. Think sweater guy in the bar from Good Will Hunting. He never formed his own opinions, only restated incredibly nuanced thoughts already made by literary geniuses in order to impress those around him. Some might call him a pseudo-intellectual, while the term toolshed can more concisely give off the same message. The guy is trying to sound smart. Will would be the opposite of pretentious, someone who is trying to appear less intelligent than he really is, when, in reality, he knows more than anyone in the room.
Wood drastically underestimates the impact
Wood
of
drastically underestimates the impact of social distinctions predicated upon wealth, especially inherited wealth. You got that from Vickers. Work in Essex County, page 98, right? Yeah, I read that too. Were you gonna plagiarize the whole thing for us? Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter?
However, what about people who are generally smart enough to make such claims? To answer this, let me show an example. Let me ask you, is this a well-written paragraph? The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power. I understood about 10 words in that sentence, and the judge of the bad writing contest, Dennis Dunn, would argue not only is this bad writing, but is nothing more than a way to boost the author's ego. The Bad Writing Contest was a contest in the 90s asking students to submit examples of real-life, non-ironically published scholarly articles that were as confusing as they were a waste of time. Entries would range from somewhat confusing to straight-up nonsensical, as readers would find themselves looking over the same sentence to decipher any meaning. Using the contest as a lens, we can start to see what something labeled pretentious looks like. A pretentious piece of writing does nothing more than confuse the reader with self-proclaimed scholarly writing to appear intelligent. Even though the author might be smart enough to understand what they are writing, the actual work does nothing more but confuse the audience with unnecessarily complicated scholarly terms. Essentially, an appearance of intelligence in order to, or resulting in, the emptiness beneath the pseudo-intellectual jargon. This style of writing alienates the writer from the reader, from the so-called professional from the average Joe, therefore making someone that understands this nonsense, or at least pretends to, feel superior to their counterparts. Using intellectual writing as a marker of whether someone is smart or not only makes stupid people think they're smarter than they really are. Again, the sweater guy from Good Will Hunting. It is no secret then that anything pretentious comes off as full of itself, rude, disingenuous, or stuck up. However, knowing what pretentious writing looks like, what does a pretentious film look like? I started to write this video because of a recent family movie night. I chose Her, my favorite movie, to watch with my family. Honestly, I can't recommend this movie for a family movie night because there's so many sex scenes, but I wanted members of my family to watch a movie that I think is absolutely amazing. After the credits rolled, however, I was met with less than enthusiastic responses. My sister said it was bad, my mom said it was weird, my brother said it was pretentious, and that he got mad while watching it. I was baffled to say the least, especially with that last comment. I never saw this movie as anything close to pretentious. My brother viewed it as exactly that. Although pretentious writing may be easy to spot, I believe that pretentious movies are a little more difficult to find. I think this is because visually, pretentious writing is much shorter than pretentious movies. Paragraphs compared to dozens of scenes and hours of movies are less lengthy to digest. Also, while pretentious writing becomes pretentious from overly complicated words and needlessly convoluted sentences making a lack of any real message, much more goes into a film than dialogue. To develop an idea in film, one must dissect the interactions between characters, how the thing develops, the particular style of the movie, and more. It simply takes more time to sit through a pretentious movie than a pretentious piece of writing. And having the term pretentious being an insult that both boosts the aggressor and degrades the work, it acts as a common phrase to explain why someone doesn't like a movie, even if that movie doesn't come out exactly as pretentious. In order to put an end to the term pretentious as a catch-all phrase for a reason to not like movies, let's look at common examples of pretentious movies and find out what makes a movie pseudo-intellectual. When deciding if a film is pretentious or not, we have to keep a definition for pretentious in mind and relate it to movies. I feel as though a film that fails to convey a certain message but acts like it does is a solid way to relate the two. In other words, a movie that fails at being profound, revealing a meaningless core. This is hard to find, as, again, a lot goes into a movie. How can one simply determine if a film is meaningless? Although the line in between art and trash can be gray, I feel like there are a lot more obvious indicators of a movie failing to convey an idea that act like it's doing something special. The first of which being, the core of any movie is its theme. I'm assuming if you're watching this video you know what a theme is, but just in case, the theme is the author's view of the world. It is the ultimate message or messages the film is trying to get across. Essentially, it is the reason the film is being made. However, films do not start with a theme already fully developed. If they did, there would be no point in making movies. Movies become movies and say what they want to say through thematic development. However, it's not as simple as it sounds. How does one develop a theme? How does one do it well, or in a unique way, in order to differentiate itself from other movies with similar themes? There's a lot that goes into answering this question, but essentially everything in the movie works to develop a theme. Characters with opposing ideologies butting heads, symbols, how those symbols develop, character choices, which philosophies come out on top, the depiction of the story world, the depiction of characters, character arcs, everything works to develop the theme. However, a movie can come off as pretentious when the theme is developed in an obvious way, almost as if the movie's beating the audience over the head with an idea saying, "Look at this, isn't this so deep and smart?" for 2 hours. Obvious themes, symbols, or ideas are an easy way to make your audience lose interest, as they already know what the movie's about, and if the movie keeps saying the same ideas over and over again, it can get tiresome and come off as shallow, and therefore pretentious. An example many moviegoers point to as a movie that comes off as pretentious because of obvious symbols and themes is Darren Aronofsky's Mother. Many say this is pretentious because it's a 2-hour metaphor with not much else, simply an overtly stated recreation of a story from the Bible. Reviews from Rotten Tomatoes call it a pretentious mess, the worst movie of the century, and lacking a human core stuck in a mess of theological ideas. In other words, pretentious by lacking a voice through all of its poorly developed ideas. If you recall from my abbreviated list of what develops a theme, the term character was heavily used. This is because characters are essentially voices of the author, ways for the creator of the story to voice different opinions, ideas, philosophies, etc. What these characters say and do help develop the theme. However, similar to developing themes, it can come off as pretentious when characters are nothing more than a vehicle for an author's idea. When a character is poorly developed, has needlessly complicated dialogue, and only serves the purpose of sharing an idea to the audience and not being an actual fully realized character, it can be seen as pretentious or a lazy attempt by the director to squeeze in some extra complicated ideas without having to do the hard work of creating a character. Again, looking at the film community, many would call some of Interstellar's cast pretentious characters that act as nothing more than vehicles for ideas. The main culprit is usually Anne Hathaway's Dr. Brand. Anyone that has seen Interstellar is probably familiar with her now notorious speech on the idea of love. In this scene, Dr. Brand tries to convince Cooper to go to Dr. Edmund's planet as opposed to Dr. Mann's. She claims that they should go to Dr. Edmund's planet because of some promising data, but mostly because she thinks that love is some supernatural force that has to mean more than we think. This scene can come off as pretentious as this extended line of dialogue contradicts her character. She's a scientist. That means she should be the first person to know that love is a chemical. Therefore, the scene can come off as overly sentimental. Also, Dr. Mann is an obvious symbol for humanity in the film, and how he can be selfish, untamed beast.
You're feeling it, aren't you? A survival instinct. That's what drove me.
However, making a character show up in a movie for 20 minutes with the name Dr. Mann represent all of humanity can come off as pretentious because he acts as a simple vehicle for a more complicated message. This is an example that is hard to come by in most films because a lot of feature-length movies have the knowledge to make sure this doesn't happen, but there are always a few stinkers out there. Unearned emotional moments are the parts during a movie where the characters on screen are pouring their hearts out in spurts of line dialogue or cheesy on-the-nose writing. For those who don't know, every piece of dialogue has to have some form of subtext to give it any interesting meaning. On-the-nose dialogue is the opposite, where the characters say exactly what they mean. Moments where the characters are supposedly feeling everything in the world while the audience sits blankly in their seats wondering why the characters are crying are unearned emotional moments. Emotional moments are incredibly meaningful when they are earned, but how do you do this? Again, a lot goes into answering this question, but some of the main ways to make sure your emotional moment is earned is by having fully developed characters and solid chemistry. Chemistry usually comes from the actor's capabilities and the characters being able to share at least one core belief. Many times, a scene that makes the audience cry can be the most memorable of the film, which is why so many movies try to draw on the emotion of the viewers. When done poorly, however, it is unbearable to sit through. It comes off as a cheap way to get the audience engaged. Again, a scene that acts like it's doing something special when in reality it's doing the opposite. If two underdeveloped characters begin speaking to each other in a heartfelt way with on-the-nose writing, it only becomes cringy rather than deep or heartfelt. Think of pretty much every scene between Anakin and Padme in the prequel trilogy. The writing is atrocious, incredibly on the nose with phrases that try to sound deep but only fail from the lack of any real meaning behind them. The characters are so underdeveloped and share nothing in common. It's like two action figures talking to each other. This comes off as pretentious because, looking back at our definition, it is trying to get a reaction from the audience by pretending to do something meaningful when it actually fails to garner any emotion. Monologues should usually be reserved for a couple special situations that are necessary to force a character to take a new path or undergo some change. The monologue by Mufasa in The Lion King works because at the moment Mufasa appears in the clouds, Simba is at his worst and completely lost. Mufasa's words push Simba into a new direction and keeps the story going. When looking at a bad monologue, again look to Anakin's descriptions about Stan in the prequels, George Lucas tries to make it sound meaningful by having him relate something personal to Padme, but it is so on the nose and results in such little change that not only does it come off as overly sentimental, but completely meaningless. Perhaps the thing that most people find pretentious about a movie is when it takes itself too seriously. When a topic is treated with a gritty tone in a way where the tone doesn't match the content, it can be pretty jarring. And when the concept of taking something too seriously is paired with the other items on the toolshed checklist, I can see how it would come off as pretentious. For example, back to Interstellar and Dr. Brand. In her monologue about love, the deep score in the background and camera zoom on her face gives off the mood of a serious scene. However, as we previously discussed, the monologue itself seems out of place and overly emotional. When the added aspects such as background music and camera work try to force the viewer to take an overly emotional monologue seriously, it only comes off as that much more ridiculous. Rather than bring the viewer into the scene for an intense moment, the film only alienates the viewer by forcing the idea that something deep is taking place. However, the speech in Interstellar is only one instance in a pretty solid film. So what does an entire movie that takes itself too seriously look like? Many people would point to the DCEU as a prime example of movies that are overly dark, but I think the movie that takes itself seriously to the extreme is Batman vs Superman. On the surface, this movie is fine. Everyone knows how rushed it feels and how little the movie makes sense, but something about the movie that is especially insulting is how tone-deaf it is. The movie focuses around two superheroes fighting. There's a lot more to the plot, but everyone only came to the theater to see the two titans of the DC universe throw down. Of course, this movie is allowed to introduce more concepts besides two heroes fighting. Why'd it have to be as serious as it is? Especially when the climax of the movie adds in another hero, a rock monster on some island, and a ton of forced comedic lines from supposedly the most serious hero in all of comics.
Oh, shit.
Add a plethora of politics, lens flares, and color grading, and this movie has a very serious tone at some parts, and an incredibly goofy one at others that simply don't blend. This becomes a problem when the movie tries to tackle themes such as power, humanity, who is worthy of power, and so on. By forcing a goofy tone to be serious when dealing with serious topics, or a serious tone to be goofy while still discussing incredibly heavy topics, the movie can come off as simply trying to be something it's not. Pair this with the idea of obvious symbols we discussed earlier, and the tone deafness of the film can start to come off as somewhat pretentious and surface level. However, some people wouldn't call this movie pretentious in the slightest. Some could find this movie entertaining or thought-provoking. This is where the definition of pretentious can get complicated. When we think of something pretentious, especially when dealing with film, we think of something being surface level, meaningless, or dull, while pretending to evoke a greater sense of detail or thought. This sounds straightforward, except it is anything but, as deciding what is pretentious and what isn't is completely subjective. Now, let me just explain something to you. Okay, did me saying let me explain something to you sound pretentious, maybe aggressive, that I was implying I have a greater importance because I must stoop to your level to explain something? Or were you completely unfazed, as you assumed your understanding of general concepts is on par with me, therefore I'm addressing you as an equal? This is an example of how the definition can be completely subjective. After all, pretentious people probably never try to act pretentious, except for the sweater guy. They just speak in an intellectual manner, while everyone else in the conversation thinks, wow, what a real tool shed for using the word indubitably. What I'm trying to say is that deciding whether something is pretentious or not is all in the hands, or minds rather, of the viewer. Some people probably didn't find any problem with the love speech in Interstellar as many others have. In fact, some may have found that scene to be thought-provoking. This term is the opposite of pretentious. Thought-provoking implies that there is enough content to truly think deeply, while as we know by now, pretentious is essentially synonymous with shallow. The The debate between a movie being pretentious or thought-provoking is near impossible to find a correct answer to because everyone's understanding of art is different in some way. Going back to my experience with Her, I found this movie to be incredibly emotional and have enough there to think about the developing themes of loneliness and humanity. Not a single moment felt like it was taken too seriously, overly emotional, and so on. Obviously, there are some structural elements that go into the sense of fluid thematic development, but when it comes down to it, not everyone will find meaning in a film. It's as simple as that. No matter how well made, how rich content-wise, no matter how thought-provoking a movie is, someone can simply not find meaning in any of it and call it pretentious or shallow. It gets to the point where, like my brother and I, one person's genius is another person's pretentious. I think there are many aspects of Her that make it a truly thought-provoking film, but I can also admit that I find such meaning in that movie because of the time in my life I watched it. Watching it for the first time with your family where every sex scene is stripped of its meaning by instantly becoming awkward would definitely dampen the overall effectiveness of the movie. This is why so many movie watchers now throw around the term pretentious so effortlessly. It's hard to find what makes a movie pretentious, especially on the first viewing. So if a viewer didn't like a movie because they didn't find any meaning from it, the simplest thing to do is call it pretentious, compliment yourself, and move on. However, this is obviously not the right way to go about critiquing movies. I believe there are aspects to a film that can affect how its message and meaning is being developed, some of which we previously discussed. However, this doesn't matter if someone simply didn't enjoy the movie and is completely blind to any of the background details that make a film thought-provoking. So if it's all subjective, is it possible to decide if a movie is pretentious? I think yes, but it would take lots of analyzing and deep understanding of story structure and filmmaking techniques to make a strong, evidence-based argument on why something is pretentious. On the other hand, ultimately, if you enjoy a movie, then enjoy the movie, no matter what other people think of it. So, not to call out Michael Murphy on Letterboxd who gave Her half a star for being pretentious, but maybe you just didn't get it. Does that sound pretentious?